Welcome back to the Ultraviolet Tide. We are so excited for you to join us for another week of the podcast. And today we are very excited to welcome a special guest. JESSEE, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you both.
We're excited to have you, and we think today's conversation surrounding processing grief and healing is a very important one, especially for this community. But before we even fully dive into the episode, I do want to give you a brief introduction so the audience can know you a little bit more before we dive in. So JESSEE Brisendine is an internationally recognized lifestyle strategist, creator of Zero Limits Coaching, speaker, and author based in Santa Barbara, California. His mission is to educate and empower individuals and organizations to move beyond their limits. JESSEE has worked with thousands of people around the world, ranging from business leaders to medical professionals, on breaking through limiting beliefs, uncovering their unique purpose, and creating fulfilling lives. And JESSEE, I know this is just the tip of the iceberg for the work you do, so can you tell us a little bit more about your background and your mission?
Yeah, I am that person who I was my first client. I think a lot of us, as we evolve in any sort of expertise, we often evolve there from ourselves being our first project. Our business, our tinkering turns into something that we want to do a little bit more with, and then it eventually evolves into a passion. And I was very much that person, growing up shy, insecure, the most self-conscious person you'd ever meet. Walked around head hanging low, eyes on the floor, believed that I was an abomination in the world and struggled with, thoughts of suicide through most of my childhood, to growing up and into myself and really learning about me and learning to understand myself, learning to get to know myself, and ultimately learning to like and even love myself. And as I was on that journey, I thought, gosh, I can't be the only person out there that struggles with thinking and feeling this way. I can't be the only person out there, questioning who they are and their existence, and feeling like the deck is stacked against them, that life is so much harder than it is, that if I could be able to then reach those people, if I could be able to teach something to them, to offer something to them, I felt that that was really where my calling was in life. And basically my whole, big kid life, I call it, has been about trying to figure out ways, or evolving ways, that I'm able to help and reach people do that and live a better life.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think what you said about, maybe having the cards stacked against you is definitely something that our audience has felt before. I'm certain that when a lot of people listening receive their first maybe skin cancer diagnosis, or a loved one who received their first skin cancer diagnosis, you definitely feel like the cards may be stacked against you. And, I did want to talk about, really dive into the importance of dealing with grief, because that is something that is easier said than done. And a lot of the times it's easier to push it down and not deal with it,
Yep.
because we don't always have the tools to deal with it. Can you dive a little bit into that and kind of the importance of dealing with that grief?
Absolutely. When I was a kid, I remember my grandma, who she insisted on me calling Nana, because grandmas were old and Nana was ageless. Nana ever aged beyond 37, I think she said. And Nana had this trash compactor in her laundry room. And what you would do is you would take the trash from the kitchen, you put it in the compactor, you push a button, it shoves it down. And you could do that 3 or 4 times until you'd finally have it filled, and you take it out to the outside trash. And it gave this illusion that there was space, and that there was space to be able to add more stuff. But what you didn't see is the stuff that was constantly getting depressed down. It wasn't going away. It was spilling out. It was oozing out. It was starting to seep out into the rest of the system. And so you notice that there was this smell, this odor, that everything kind of got toxic around it because of it. And oftentimes we approach our feelings in much the same way as that trash compactor would focus on its daily duty. It's shoving it down, thinking that we're making space. But what we're really doing is we're depressing and smushing down, and we're covering up that which is underneath. And that which underneath, since it hasn't been expressed, it hasn't been taken out, removed, what it starts to do instead is it almost starts to, think of it as kind of rotting or molding and permeating the rest of the system. Mm-hmm. Most of our intense emotions are like that. And I would suggest that probably none more so than grief, because grief is one of those ones that comes with obviously the greatest levels of intensity. And it's also for most of us one of the most foreign too. And usually it's those things that we don't understand that we want to try to run from the fastest. It's
Mhm.
that fight or flight system starts to kick in, and especially when we're faced with the life altering circumstances that brought on the grief in the first place. We just received a cancer diagnosis, or a friend or family or loved one did too. And our biology takes over, and we're trying everything we can do to either figure out, how do we go and face this? How do I deal with this? It doesn't seem like we have space to deal with the emotion because it feels distracting. It can feel debilitating. It can feel like if we go down that pit, we'll never be able to come out. But the truth is, while it may feel that way, we will be much better served to be able to face whatever's in front of us by dealing first with what's in us, by taking out the trash. You know, Nana's laundry room would have always smelled so much sweeter if she would have just taken the trash out each time, right? Dealt with it right then, as opposed to depressing it over and over and over again.
I think a lot of the times that's kind of what people do because you just don't know what to do. I mean, it's not something that people talk about as often as we want. And I think you made such an important differentiator that it's not grief comes in so many different shapes and forms. It's not always a death. Like maybe it's not always losing a friend or a family member or a community member, but it can also be a grieving a loss of maybe how you were living your life. Maybe you were living it carefree and out in the sun and not thinking about it. And now you have this diagnosis and you're like, oh my gosh, now I'm grieving the life I was able to live before. And Snigdha, I don't know. I mean, I think that is something that would relate to our community. What do you think about that as well?
Yeah, for sure. And I think grief is one of those emotions that takes many forms, and it manifests itself in different ways depending on how the person is processing said emotion. I've seen, I think, an interview of Andrew Garfield. His mom had recently passed away, and he was doing an interview with Stephen Colbert. And, he was kind of sharing his grief publicly on stage with Stephen. And he was saying, I love my mom so much, but the grief that I have is just leftover love. And I don't know what to do with it. There's just so much, and I don't know what to do with it. And he was, on stage openly grieving, and he was crying. And, the audience was also asking him questions and stuff. But I think in terms of our audience, there's so many different ways that it can manifest. As you said, one person might be grieving the lifestyle that they've lost because of this devastating cancer diagnosis. It might be they're seeing their aunt suffer and they don't know how to help her. And I feel like there's so many different manifestations of grief within the community.
Yeah, I appreciate both of you calling attention to the lifestyle loss in regards to grief, because one of the things that's tricky, especially with these intense emotions when we're feeling it, it's a strange thing to say, but we can start to feel guilty for feeling it as intensely as we do because we start to compare what we're going through to someone else. When I first started getting into this space, I would approach loss very open-ended because I'd worked with enough people at that point where if I surveyed people, and whether it's somebody who had gone through a diagnosis, somebody who had lost a loved one, somebody who had gone through an end of a relationship, somebody who had lost a job. And when you really started to break down the emotion that they were described behind what they were feeling, it was very similar. And so if you took away the stimulus, the job, the death, the diagnosis, the relationship, if you had nothing else to judge it by, you would think that these people were going through the exact same or similar thing. But when you bring it into conversation, the person who lost their job might feel a little bit ashamed because while they lost a job, who are they to feel as deeply as a person who just found out that they have a terminal illness?
Mm.
That's one of the challenges that I think we really face in having conversations around this, because we've learned very much, and I think social media in some ways has exaggerated this. The comparison is just, it's kind of this thing that we all do now. We all have, with one little swipe, we can see anybody who is doing something different than us, better than us, more successfully than us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's someone, I can't remember who said it, comparison is the thief of joy. It very much is too, but I'd also argue that comparison is the gateway to emotional prison.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is we will often lock ourselves away, suppress, depress what we're feeling because we're afraid to have conversation with it, because who are we in context of? Experience is the ultimate teacher, right? And so for us who are going through something, we don't have an experience. If it's the first time we're going through something, we don't have life experience as a point of reference to be able to qualify or quantify this is more or less than. All we have is what I'm feeling and experiencing now. And when you try to engage in conversations, especially with folks who are going through similar levels of intense emotional experiences, it can be a slippery footing at times because some of them are so invested into the narrative behind the emotions that the narrative will almost supersede what's actually being felt. And what I mean by that is there's I'm feeling this, and then there's I'm feeling this because of X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C. And when we start to bring more narratives into it, especially having conversations, our tendency can be to shut back and withdraw. I don't know about either of you, but I remember sitting in a workshop one time, and the person who was facilitating was asking people to share. We had just done this exercise, and what came up for everybody. And you can tell the exercise had really moved a couple people, quite a few people, and there's probably 400 people in the room. So two people throw their hands up, and the facilitator calls on them, and they say, something really, really great, but it's nothing so mind blowing or profound. They're kind of softballs, right? And everybody's, oh yeah, me too, me too. And then more hands go up because now people have confidence in it. They're sharing, right? They're getting acknowledged. It seems like everybody's going through the shared experience. Somebody puts their hands up, and it's just this huge thing. Something about how they had lost a loved one, and that what came up was this very healing thing, and they felt like such a sense of inner peace, and that they felt like they reclaimed a part of themselves that they lost before. Really moving, really inspiring, really powerful, and a powerful testament to the exercise. But then what you saw is all the hands that were up started to go down.
Interesting.
Because people didn't want to go afterwards, because now they were no longer focused on their experience and honoring that. They were now almost maybe embarrassed, shameful of bringing it up, because who are they to share in comparison to that? Or, I don't want to be the one to have to say after that, how can I follow that act? And so these are really interesting things when we enter into a dialogue with this, because it's important that if we're going to be people who are engaging in those dialogues, to honor that where it's not just about the emotion. What's also really important that we recognize is sometimes to get to the emotion, we have to navigate around the comparison and the shame that might come, or the embarrassment, or the self-doubt, or the questioning that might accompany that.
Yeah, and I think something that goes off of it too is we talk all the time about community, because having a community is so important. And you talked about how meaningful communication, I hope I quote this correctly, how meaningful communication creates meaningful change. And I think this kind of ties in that if you're fostering a community where people are understanding and you're encouraging each other to voice these experiences and not making one seem more powerful or stronger than the other, there's a lot of power in that for healing.
It's so spot on. And the dynamic, I think we don't have to really do anything. The dynamic we have the opportunity to explore is, especially when we're beginning to engage in those conversations, because so many of those dynamics are built on trust. And trust is a really interesting thing, right? Because we look at trust as like, okay, I'm going to tell you both a secret. And then if one of you keeps the secret and one of you doesn't, then that means I can trust one of you and I can't trust the other person. And we kind of think of trust as that exchange thing. But trust is really what it is. It's an implicit basis. It's a foundational piece of our structure, our civilization, humanity, how we exist and coexist with one another. An easy example is we walk outside, we get in a car, we drive from point A to point B. If we're on the road with other cars, we have an implicit trust, literally with our very lives, and the person who's on the other side of the road, that they are going to respect the laws of the road. They're not going to cross over and hit us and kill us. Right. So you think about that. We will trust complete strangers with our lives. We don't think about it that way, but we do. We get on an airplane. Most of us don't know the pilot. We have no idea what's going on in their life before. We just assume that they're going to get us from point A to point B, and we're going to be able to kick back and hopefully avoid turbulence. So recognizing how trust is, right? I think one of the first things we need to do when we engage in meaningful conversation is we need to allow a space of trust, and where we can allow that is separating impulses from intention. The intention of people in meaningful communication is going to be likely, I'm here to support, I'm here to encourage, I'm here to listen, I'm here to try to learn. Those would be some of the intentions most of us are going to come to a meaningful communication is. The impulse is when something is said or spoken that kind of emotionally stirs us up. It can feel like a violation of trust. It's like when we're driving on the freeway, the person cuts us off. We think the story we tell ourselves in that moment is, oh, that jerk, you know who you are and wasn't paying attention. For all we know, they just got a phone call that maybe someone that they love and care about is sick in the hospital and they're trying to race to get there. The point is they know nothing about us, but we're making the story about us. And so we break trust in that moment because they violated it from the perspective that we're saying. When we want to engage in meaningful conversation, to separate impulses from intention, part of the challenge for all of us in person engaging this is to hold the intention always at the forefront of our impulse. The impulse is going to come when we might feel that trust is violated because somebody doesn't quite say it the same way we did, or maybe they're speaking about a different thing, or maybe they're comparing, or maybe they're saying something that's not relevant, or maybe they're making it more about them and then really giving us feedback and empathizing with us. That doesn't contribute to meaningful conversation. That creates a division in the conversation. And again, it's a natural response. We want to protect ourselves, right? In fight or flight, we're always wrestling with biology, hijacking ourselves. But if we can hold intention at the forefront, meaning that the three of us who are in this conversation right now, we're coming here genuinely from a heartfelt place to serve, and we can always keep that at the top of the mind. What it does is it creates more space to navigate through some of our own emotional growth and discomfort as it comes up, because it will. Any of us who have ever engaged in a hard or difficult conversation know that the hardest and most difficult thing about it is not so much what needs to be said, but it's sitting through how we're feeling, right? It's staying in the conversation, even though we may want to run, we may want to turn, we may want to hide, we may want to fight. That's the hard part. It's not the words, it's the feeling. And often too, the reason we avoid those conversations, the same reason, right? It's not that we're afraid to say the words, we're afraid of the feeling that will come with the words.
I think that's something that will really resonate with people because we talk a lot about how to have those conversations with family members who maybe might not get what you're feeling, and they try and say the right thing. And our community members say all the time, there is no right or wrong thing to say. We just want to know that you're there. But it's so hard for caregivers who just want to be supportive. I mean, there's no rule book. There's no directory for how to deal with these things, which makes it so much more difficult and kind of unsettling.
Yeah, and when you take on that role of a caregiver, there's almost this implicit exchange in the relationship dynamic where most relationships, the relationships that flourish are relationships where there's reciprocity is always at the forefront, meaning we're in a relationship, I have needs, you have needs, and we're going to collectively meet each other's needs. And not only are we going to collectively meet each other's needs, but we do it from a place of love and joy. Right? I love meeting your needs. You love meeting my needs. You love seeing me happy. I love seeing you happy. When you enter into that role of a caregiver, a lot of the caregiver psychology is almost one that I have to get depressed, put my needs on a shelf, and focus 100% on serving. Super, super noble intention, right? And again, like you said, there's no rule book, and nobody, when you go into that caregiver role, there's nothing that says, hey, you need to make sure that you're still getting your needs met in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
This isn't about complete self-sacrifice. This is about service, but the service doesn't have to come at complete sacrifice. When we start to recognize that, what we can start to create dialogues between the caregivers and who they're caring for and the recipients of that is having daily check-ins around needs met. And it's something really simple where it's just, how are you feeling today? Right? On a scale of 1 to 5, or 1 to 10 is a little bit better. It gives a little bit more space to do it. And I think an 8 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10 is more easily digestible than getting a 2 out of 5. But just saying on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being low and 10 being high, and we don't have to have that every day, it's just an established scale, how are you feeling about your needs being met? And I'm at like 5 today. Oh, wow, I can, how does that feel being at a 5? Oh, it feels like this. What is there anything I can do today? Or is there anything I can support you in helping you get to a 6 or a 7?
Mhm.
And for the caregiver, that might be something as simple as it just gives them permission to say, if I could just have 15 minutes to go for a walk outside, but they feel okay about asking for it now instead of the guilt that they might feel.
Yeah.
Because, right, the caregiver role is like, gosh, I'm looking at this person who I love, I care about. They're going through hell. Who am I to ask for this other thing? Because again, my needs seem so silly in comparison to that. But the truth is the person that is being cared for, they likely want you still to be happy, to love, to thrive, to all those things, right? And they may feel a little guilt too because they see you putting so much of your life at hold to
Oh,
care for them. So
totally.
just
Yeah.
right, having this dialogue and just saying, what can that be? How can I support that? And then
Mhm.
having an open space where we can ask for that and then support. It's uplifting for both. It gives the caregiver permission to ask and do. It gives the person being cared for an opportunity to help and support them still in meeting their needs, even at a time when they may be physically unable to do it in the way they did in the past. And it helps create a really strong foundation for nurturing relationships through a challenging journey.
Yeah, I think there's so much power, and you touched on this in saying not if you don't know what to say, just asking, "What do you need from me?" And if you do not know, that is okay. I'm going to the grocery store, I'm picking up these items. Do you need milk? Do you need eggs? Do you need coffee? Do you need anything? And kind of taking kind of some of that thought process away from them and saying, I'm already going to do this. You're not going to inconvenience me. Let me know if you need anything. You're on my way back home. But just kind of learning tactics like that are definitely helpful. But I think, they're as we've said before, there is no rule book. So just figuring it out, and communication and open dialogue is certainly key. But to pivot, I did want to talk about your TEDx talk back in 2018, because you talked about how grief is not a life sentence. And I think that is an incredibly, first and foremost, an incredibly powerful title. But I think you also touch on a bunch of different things in there that I think are super important as well. And one of them is that sometimes when you're dealing with grief, you feel like if you're not experiencing pain, or the certain level of pain you're feeling has to relate to how much grief you're feeling. And you're going to be able to put it way more eloquently than me, but you touch on that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. When we're going through, call it any life altering event. So this could be a cancer diagnosis. It could be an end of a relationship, a loss of a career. When we're experiencing a death of a loved one, any sort of profound loss, and it's not for me to define what a profound loss is for whomever is watching, listening. That's their choice, right? It's their life experience. But when we're going through that, what's interesting, and especially more so when we're going through illness, death, relationship ending, you'll see this more because there's typically more people involved in the dynamics. There's family members, friends, communities. It can be very common for us to start to go down the path of, if only I would have, I wish I would have, if I could have just this. I remember when I found out my dad passed away. My dad had been diagnosed with colon cancer a few years prior. He went through a lengthy treatment with chemo, surgery, the whole bit. 2 weeks before he died, he went in for his annual checkup. The doctor looked him in the eye, shook him in his hand, said, "Congratulations, Mike, you did it. You're cancer-free. You have your whole life in front of you." And my dad was so excited because he was young. He thought he had made this choice to take care of himself, to give himself a shot at more time. He started planning out the next chapter of his life, one that was going to be free from so many of the restrictions that he had held himself back before. 2 weeks later, he dropped dead.
Hmm.
And I remember the drive to get to where my mom and dad were at that time was about 8.5, 9 hours. I drove the whole drive, save for a little bit of time in complete silence. And so much of that silence was filled with my own head going, I wish I would have, if only I would have this, if only I would have visited more, if only I would have told him I loved him more, if only I would have this. what can happen is when those life-altering losses come to play, some of us, because we're comparing, right? If I look at either one of you and you're going through a similar experience as me, but you are so just physically torn up from the grief of it all, you're crying, you're carrying yourself, there's a heaviness to you, and I don't feel the same. Again, I can start to feel guilt because I'm not doing it right.
Mhm.
I'm not feeling it as intensely as I should. And what we'll start to do is we start to look at pain almost as a penance to be a way that we qualify or quantify our love. The more guilt I feel is just reflective of the more pain. The more guilt I feel, which is pain, is going to be reflective of the depth of love I have. The more shame I feel is the only reason I feel the shame is because I love them so much. It's our
Right.
way we're trying to rationalize it almost to ourselves. And what I really encourage people to do when they're diving into, again, one of the if not the most challenging, emotionally complex and life, altering subjects to life is to separate emotions. Guilt is guilt, love is love, grief is grief. Because when we start to construct narratives around it, right, this is my penance, I have to do this because of this. The challenge with any narrative is that's call it the roots of identity. And what you'll see for people who go through a journey, and then this is where I got really curious and I ultimately led to doing the TEDx talk. I was so curious about why some people would heal and others wouldn't. Why some people are able to go on and heal, when I say heal, emotionally heal, despite whatever else had happened, whatever circumstances. Why others were able to go on and live happy and fulfilling lives and others wouldn't. Why others who had gone through something similar or this, same circumstances were able to carry on and really have the next chapter of life be truly incredible, and others weren't, but they were handcuffed to the grief and it carried it around like a dark cloud for the rest of their life. And what you start to see is so many of the folks who were stuck, if you will, they were stuck because of the identity they had started to fill around it. And it's a slippery slope, right? Because when we go back to meeting needs, like we were talking about before, in these examples, you go on Facebook, you look in your Facebook feed, and it's a little different now because the algorithms have changed so much in Facebook that we're not really seeing the organic things as much as we used to. We're seeing kind of what's curated for us.
Right.
But,
Right.
but if you remember back in the good old days when you got to see kind of real time it playing out, you might recall some of your friends who would post on Facebook, and one or two of them would say, "Oh, I've been having a great day," and maybe we even did this too. And they get one comment, and a few people like it, right? And then another person says, "Oh gosh, today's just been horrible." 15 comments, 39 likes.
Hmm.
And that person learns something really quick. They say, "Oh my gosh, like when I'm having a bad day, people love me. They connect with me. It feels really good. I want love and connection." And so the next day they report, say, "Gosh, yesterday ended up being a really great day. I feel so much happier. Thanks, everybody." 2 comments, 7 likes.
Right.
And that trend kind of continues, right? And so, well, what's going on? God, I'm feeling sad again. Oh, let's just go back on there. Awful, horrible, bad. 15 likes, 28 comments.
Hmm.
And those are obviously exaggerated examples, but it's something that we can all appreciate because we've seen it play out before in different people in our lives. We start to form identity, and identity is also ultimately a way to service and meet our needs. And so that's why it's so important to separate emotions, because we don't want to start to form narratives around the emotions that's going to ultimately fuel and become the bedrock of the identity we're going to form in the next chapter of our life.
I resonate with that example. That was a really good example. And I think one other thing you talk about that will resonate with people is how to live your life after loss and use it as an opportunity to honor the person who's no longer in your life. And I thought that was a really beautiful thing as well.
Yeah, at my very core, I believe this to be true. Emotions are so fascinating, right? So there's what I call the lie of loss. And the lie of loss is that when we lose someone or something, right, our identity of who we were, what we were able to do pre-diagnosis, somebody passes away. The perception is, the belief might be that we're losing who we were or those sources of love, connection, what we got. But we've all had that experience before where we were traveling somewhere. Maybe we were on the opposite sides of the country and we weren't physically in the presence of the people we loved and cared about, but our love for them didn't change. Because death can't kill love. Emotion supersedes physicality, right? That was always that's emotion is something so much more greater and beyond the physical structures, the belief systems that we construct to try to think that we compartmentalize emotion so it fits in this box. I feel this because of this person, so if that person's gone, I can't feel that anymore. No, no, that person was physically absent many other times, but we still felt the emotion. So I really believe that death can't kill love, and I also believe that those that we've loved and have lost, what ultimately formed was the bedrock of those relationships in our life was that love, was that connection, was how we lived our life in accordance to them, how have we related to them. And what would break their heart is to consider or to know that we had altered our lives and were living it less than we had before because of them.
Mm-hmm.
On the same note, what would probably lift them higher than any star in the sky would be to know that we chose to live our life in such an extraordinary way because of them. Mm-hmm. So it's a path, right, that can be linear, but there's two different directions we can go. But at the center of it, the spark of it is going to be that person or those persons or that identity or that thing. And I really do believe that's the great, incredible opportunity for all of us, is that how we choose to live after we've gone through a significant loss is ultimately how we choose. So it's the depth of the loved one in a relationship. It's how we can choose to honor that person. And in the case of a death, or even in the death of an identity, I think that we are entrusted, those of us who are here, we're entrusted as the custodians of that legacy. And what a beautiful opportunity to express that legacy fully, than to live it, our lives in such a way that fully honors it.
It's beautiful. And before we run out of time, I want to make sure that anyone listening who wants to continue the conversation and learn more, because this is just the beginning. We have a million more questions, but Zoom is counting us down. So I want to make sure that if anyone is listening and they're like, yes, this resonates, and they want to connect with you and learn more, where can they find you if they want to connect?
Yeah, I'm on most of the social channels. So YouTube, Instagram and Facebook are the main ones under my name. Website's my name. So you just go out there and type my name. I'll pop up. You'll find me.
Perfect. And we'll link it in the show notes as well. So it makes it super, super easy for people to find you. But Jesse, thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with us.
Thank you, both of you, for having me on and holding the space for having these kinds of conversations. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.